women are essential to society. And as I mentioned in the previous lesson, that various NGOs and organizations work to elevate their conditions, finding that women are locked in their houses, though they may know some skill, but they cannot move out of their houses. They are economically backward, they are illiterate, so they suffer from various counts, and then you add climate change to that, then they are doubly suppressed. So these organizations have understood that women have a power within them for survival, and they have skills which they can use to survive. So women can be agents of environmental change, because women are the one who are the closest to their family and to their children, and women are more active in communication with their community than men. So women can have a role in sustainability. Feminist criticism highlights how women are often at the front of environmental activism and advocating for sustainable practices and climate justice. So if anybody from outside or a man were to approach women about things related to climate justice or sustainable practices, it would not be so acceptable. But when women themselves try to bring change and awareness, it works better. So there have been so many issues these days, and we could connect them to climate change. The idea of menstrual hygiene, the idea of waste disposal. So all these are things that women can closely monitor, because they are in charge of homes, they are in charge of families, and whereas their bodies are involved, there is much they can teach others if they are sufficiently educated. Women have been a part of many grassroots movements. Here's a picture of the Chipko movement, where they are protecting the trees from being cut down. So incidentally, there are many religious ideas in various religions that talk about the sacredness of plants and trees and nature. And you can see that in some tribal areas, the trees are worshipped and women are married to the trees. So if one looks at this in a symbolic way, it brings about the reality of the deep connection between women and nature. In fact, in Zen Buddhism too, there is the idea that trees and plants, they speak, and one should learn from them. So there's another picture of the Green Belt movement. It's like about replanting and greening the areas. So this is to undo the impacts of drought, which are felt in many parts of Africa. Gendered impact of climate disasters. So women are more vulnerable than men as far as climate disaster is concerned. Natural disasters. In many cultures, women have less access to education and economic resources, which limits their ability to adapt to climate shocks. So this was what I just mentioned, that women have low literacy in villages. They are economically backward. They may have some skills, but they do not know how to use those skills for survival. So they become increasingly vulnerable to climate disasters and have difficulty in surviving them. It's like if there's a water shortage or a drought in desert areas, women have to go a great distance to go and fetch water. But just think of it, when the women travel miles and miles on foot across the desert to get that water, what do they earn in return? What do they get in return? They harm their bodies. It's a gradual sickening or a invitation to illness and dehydration. So who tells them these things? They have a low literacy. They have no access to medical clinics because they are not encouraged to move out. They are governed by patriarchy. So women are more vulnerable to climate disasters. In the same way, when there is extreme cold, it's the women who have to go and cut wood and burn fires, and they are the ones who have to see the various steps towards burning that fire, towards collecting it and cutting it, and all these things can be hazardous in extreme climate. And in this way, they harm themselves and harm their health too. But there is a basic unawareness of their own health in trying to preserve the health of the family. In addition to this, women are extremely vulnerable to violence and sexual assault, displacement and gender-based violence such as sexual assault, trafficking, drug abuse, etc. in refugee camps and disaster zones. So women are extremely vulnerable because of their sex towards all kinds of crimes, and the more climate impact is felt and the more money is needed for survival, the worse it gets as women get into trafficking, and it becomes from one complex angle to greater complexity. So this is all taken up in climate fiction. So we can see that the canvas of climate fiction is very large. It deals with the whole of human concerns. All human concerns are under the umbrella of climate, and the climate not being okay touches all the concerns, disturbs all of human life. Just as cutting down trees or killing fish disturbs the ecosystem, in the same way, women suffer the impact of climate change in various ways. And because some problem is there, either they are short of water or there's too much of rain. So something or the other happens, some extreme event, and they suffer, and it comes like a pack of cards. Feminist criticism of disaster response. So we looked at things from a feminist angle, the suppression and the exploitation of women, how it is accentuated by climate change impacts. But here is also feminist criticism of disaster response. Feminist critics argue that climate disaster response efforts often fail to consider the specific needs of women, reinforcing gender inequalities. So, a very simple example is, as mentioned earlier, is that when there's flooding in an area and when the food arrives, who gets the maximum food and who starves? It's the women who suffer the most, the weakest, the women who are sick, those who are old, and so that is a wild scramble for food and water. So this reinforces gender inequality, and this is the feminist criticism of disaster response. Gender-specific needs of women are not addressed. It is just a general response of trying to get food and water, but there is much more that is needed. For example, the safety of women is at threat. They advocate for gender-sensitive climate policies that prioritize the safety, health, and economic security of women. So it is not just giving food and water and refugee camps, but security, economic security, safety, health, they are also very important for women. Climate justice and feminism. Climate justice and feminism. Climate justice. Feminist approach to climate justice. So it can be intersectionality, the intersection of gender, race, and geography in understanding who is most affected by climate change. So even if we consider the suffering of women, the needs and the issues will be different for women living on a sea coast or living in hilly areas or those living in the desert. It's different depending on their different culture, their different geographical zones and their races. So climate justice has to be gender sensitive. Policy advocacy promotes social justice, ensures that women, especially from vulnerable communities, are included in decision-making processes. So climate justice also means that they are women who are in vulnerable communities, and they should also be considered in the policy making processes. So because of these silent women, because of their being a silent minority, they do not get considered. So they also need to be considered. So there's a critique of masculine approaches to climate change. What are the masculine approaches to climate change? Technocratic solutions such as geoengineering or technological fixes are rooted in masculine technocratic approaches that ignore the social and ethical dimensions of climate change. Focus on control, often focus on controlling nature rather than fostering a harmonious relationship with it, reflects a patriarchal mindset. So the masculine approach is one in which there is idea of control, just as there is in patriarchy, and the idea of controlling nature. So the relationship between human and nature is not harmonious. It is rather an oppressive relationship. Feminist alternatives. Feminist critics propose alternative approaches that emphasize community-based, decentralized and holistic solutions. So feminist critics emphasize that the suggestions or the resolutions to climate disasters should be community-based, should be decentralized and should be holistic. So it should not address only one community or one gender. It should be sensitive to gender as well as children, and it should involve the whole community. Other alternatives are to prioritize care, collaboration and sustainability over control and exploitation. Such examples are there in literature, such as alternative cooperative futures, where both gender equality and ecological balance are achieved. So we can see that climate literature not only talks about dark futures of the end of the world, but also talks about a new future, new hope, and a future where there is gender equality and ecological balance. Maternal and reproductive themes in climate change literature. Motherhood and environmental protection. In many feminist climate narratives, motherhood is portrayed as closely linked to environmental problems. Female characters fight to save the planet for future generations. So, in many of these books, it is shown that female characters are trying to fight because they want to save future generations. So the idea of motherhood is there. or there may be a representation through mothers in animals or birds. There is a symbolism of motherhood in nature. Reproductive rights and climate change. Impact on women's bodies. Direct impacts on women's reproductive health, including access to safe childbirth, clean water, and nutrition. So, in contrast to the male body, the female body needs much more because it reproduces, and so the need is there for attending to women's reproductive health, for safe childbirth, for clean water and nutrition. So the impact on the woman's body is something that determines the futures, the kind of generation that comes forth, its health and its wholeness depends on the woman that gives birth. So climate change is closely linked to the reproductive rights of women. Reproductive justice. Women, especially in marginalized communities, should have the right to make informed choices about their reproductive lives in the context of environmental challenges. So once again, this reproductive right, reproductive justice is very important. And in Asian societies where women are suppressed and unable to express their wishes, they need to make informed choices. They should have a right to decide what they want with their lives, and especially in the case of the reproductive choices in the context of environmental challenges. Depending on this knowledge, there is more hope for better health for a woman. In a desert where there is a shortage of water, in a place where there is no access to food, it is extremely important for a woman to have a choice as far as her reproductive life is concerned. To have children or not to have children, she should have that right to decide. So, examples of literary exploration in this context could be Octavio Butler's Parable of the Sower. Indigenous feminism and climate change. So, the knowledge of women in tribal areas, that is knowledge that can lead to sustainable practices. This indigenous wisdom of women living in local areas, in tribes, has shown that they have a long-standing knowledge of sustainable environmental practices. The way they cook their food, often the way they reared their animals, the way they build their houses, the way they maintain their health, their reproductive health. All these things are sustainable practices in many cases, and one can learn a lot from them. So, feminist criticism highlights the importance of incorporating this wisdom, this indigenous women's wisdom in climate change discourse. So, when we look at climate discourse, when we talk about the effect of climate change, we tend to see only women in the urban areas. So we tend to look at women in the common street using automobiles or using mobiles, or they are in their homes and kitchens. But it is not so in local areas, in tribal, far-flung areas. um, the knowledge that they have of surviving in forests or surviving on river coasts, that is far superior to the style of living in cities and affluent towns, because these women, they live in proximity with nature, and they know how to use the resources of nature in a proper manner, in a sustainable way. When they are short of water, they know how to recycle water and use it responsibly. So it's not the same if we talk about urban settings. Women have also been great sufferers in colonialism and environmental exploitation, which have gone hand in hand. Indigenous feminist critics argue that colonial practices of resource extraction have disproportionately harmed indigenous women and their lands. So, colonialism and imperialism has destroyed their ways of life, the way these women survive in proximity to nature, whether it's on the coast or where is in the hillsides or in the deserts. They have certain ways of survival, there are certain kinds of traditions that they follow, there's a certain sanctity given to nature. And for example, we know that in a desert like Rajasthan, uh, there is a shortage of fresh fruits and vegetables. But women there know about the existence of certain trees that are very useful, and they thrive in the desert, and using the fruit and the seeds of that tree, they make flour, they use the tree stems as and the leaves as vegetables in their curries. So they are sort of acquainted with the environment. They know what can be grown there, and they know how to adapt when the climate becomes severe. But colonial and environmental exploitation have disturbed that connection by trying to put other crops there, put other trees there, or destroy those villages and start building resorts and hotels. So, this is the thing that women, according to feminist critiques, women are very close to nature, and indigenous knowledge that they possess is very valuable. And some literary examples are indigenous feminist writers like Leslie Marmon Silko and Linda Hogan, who explore the connections between land, gender, and colonialism, emphasizing the role of indigenous women in fighting for environmental justice. So, in India also, we have many women writers who are talking about land, gender, and colonialism, and they are fighting for environmental justice. One of them is Vandana Shiva, Critique of Capitalism and Consumerism, Gendered Impact of Capitalism. Capitalist systems prioritize profit over people and the environment and are a major driver of climate change. So, as we already know, this capitalist system and the profit motive that we see from day to day in all the products that are out there in the market, many of them ignore the very fact that they are harming nature. Women, particularly in developing countries, are often the most affected by capitalist exploitation of natural resources. So, this exploitation of natural resources, it hurts women the most in developing countries. Consumer culture. The consumer culture promotes unsustainable practices. Women are frequently targeted by industries promoting consumption, and feminist critics argue for more sustainable anti-consumerist lifestyles. So I have such a good example. We had this ad for years and years together of Fair and Lovely, and then the voices started, rising against it. That why this discrimination between the fair and the dark woman? Why is dark wrong? Why is it unacceptable? So, exploiting women, exploiting the complexion of women to sell creams is just a very small part of the whole mechanism of capitalism. So, after that, Fair and Lovely changed, and now it is something like Glow and Lovely. That's the name it is given. So, in this way, all the things that are related to women, they are exploited in some way or the other, so that women consumers may buy more and more of those products. So capitalism goes hand in hand with patriarchy and environmental destruction. So an example of this is in The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi, who explores how corporate greed exacerbates environmental and social inequalities. After having discussed psychoanalytical theory and feminist criticism, we come to Marxist criticism and its connection with climate change. So, Marxist criticism is connected with Karl Marx and deals with society and culture, and one can apply it to climate change. The working class and marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by climate change. So it's like a double cycle of destruction, where the working cycle was at the mercy of the capitalist class, and then the environment also, climate also became a victim of that capitalist class. And then the outcome of it was that the worst affected was the working class. So that this is indeed ironical, and it is mentioned in Marxist criticism of these books. And though Marxism and then communism aim to bring equality in society, it is apparent that the effects are disproportionate in different countries, where there are different classes of the poor and different professions. So Marxist criticism has also been applied to climate change. As I just mentioned, capitalism is a cause of climate change, and then capitalism is also responsible for the weakest classes suffering the outcomes of climate change. Capitalist exploitation of nature, commodification of nature. In capitalist economies, nature is commodified, turned into goods. So nature is not seen as any living entity, rather it is seen as a commodity to be turned into goods and sold. Profit motive over sustainability. Numerous stories of climate change and poetry and drama and novels, they all deal with this idea of short-term profits, business-oriented goals of industries who disregard the long-term environmental sustainability, causing large-scale ecological harm. So we'll stop here. Thank you for attending this lesson. I hope you learned something more about the theories that are related to climate change. We'll meet in the next lesson. Thank you.